Good morning from Geneva, Switzerland. My name is Casey Harden, and I'm with the Worldwide WCA, a movement of women leaders all around the globe. And I'm so excited to be with you today in whatever time zone that you are in for the second day of the Symposium on Communication for Social Justice in a Digital Era. Before we begin, a reminder that we have translation on this platform in Spanish, German, and French. Also, the program is being live streamed, and you can look for the details on that on the site for this event. And a lot of the content from the 3 days is being recorded and will be shared again and available in a number of different manners after our 3 days are over. So yesterday, we began this international symposium exploring the challenges and opportunities for a more just digital world. We asked, what do social justice and social injustice look like in the digital era, especially for marginalized people and communities? We were challenged to be keenly aware of not just the benefits of connection and the increased participation that digital platforms can enable, but also the challenges and the darker aspects of surveillance, militarism, and increased marginalization. We were called to be not only more aware, but to actively claim and protect human rights in the digital sphere. So today we're going to focus on public space and ask ourselves another key question, and that's, in what ways has the digital era changed the notion of public space? This morning, we'll have a greeting from a co-organizer of the symposium, and then we'll watch a video together to set the context for our discussion. We'll hear a unique perspective focusing on a region of the globe related to our key question from a more socio-political context, and then we'll have a response with a theological perspective. But first, we have greetings from one of the co-organizers of the symposium. I'm pleased to introduce Reverend Rainier Kiefer of the Association of Protestant Churches and Missions of Germany, or EMW.
Dear friends, cordial greetings to all of you from Hamburg. The EMW is the Association of Protestant Churches and Missions in Germany. The World Association for Christian Communication, WAC, as well as the World Council of Churches are among our long-standing partners and friends. It has been a great pleasure to organize and plan this symposium with colleagues from the WCC, the WAC, and other organizations. I'm impressed by the number of participants from so many regions of the world. Welcome. We started the planning process early, and we're aiming for an international and intergenerational discussion on the challenges for social justice in a digital age. I'm grateful for the engagement and the professional management of the planning process by my colleagues. We have gained from their experience, wisdom, and patience. It is obvious that our discussions will not end with this symposium, but will need to be continued in all our networks, in churches, with journalists and persons in the media, with politicians and representatives of non-governmental and faith-based organizations. EMW is a partner of worldwide bodies and of regional ecumenical organizations and national church councils. They all experience new opportunities which the digital world offers for their mission. But they all are confronted by new questions like which consequences to draw from their commitment to justice, peace, and the integrity of creation for a just and participatory design of this new public space. And our members and partners, EMW is working with institutions for theological education on an international level. With the financial support of the Protestant churches in Germany, we are privileged to support the training of professionals and laypersons in ecumenical networks and churches. The themes which are being discussed at our symposium are also a crucial matter of interest in the context of theological education. How do we use the blessings of digital communication? And how do we defend our values when facing the obvious risks and dangers? What can we learn from one another? And how do we have to change our habits and ways of working and communicating? These are questions which need to be discussed by all of us in depth. I'm convinced that we can learn a lot from one another. Together with our partners and friends in Germany and worldwide, we believe in taking part in God's mission of reaching out to the world and bringing about healing and reconciliation. We feel honored to be able to contribute to this mission, and we are looking forward to further cooperation with all of you on our way to the assembly of the World Council of Churches in 2022 in Karlsruhe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Reverend Kiefer. Some of your words have really jumped out and I think highlighted a key context for today. And that's the blessings of digital communication and also healing and reconciliation that is necessary and paramount as we do use the public space to do our work. So now begins a video to help us understand the importance of our conversation today and add to what the Reverend has shared, and also to create a common context on what we mean when we say public space or what we mean when we say public sphere. So with that, here's our short video.
One of the pillars of communication rights is communication in a public sphere. So, what is a public sphere? The public sphere is an area where people, including media, can express their thoughts and feelings about political and societal issues so they could freely participate towards democracy. So basically, it is just like a free flow of information. You speak not on the behalf of any business or associates, but a citizen who wants to help in dealing with variety of matters. The good thing is, there is no right or wrong. Everyone is welcome as long as the content of your speech is relevant. Normal people has the chance to influence politicians on their future plans for the country. Others consider this as the protection against abuse of power. It is based in Article 21 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, stating that, first, everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country. It may be directly or through freely chosen representatives. Second, everyone has the right of equal access to public service in his country. And third, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. And in order for this to all work, people who wish to participate in the area requires to attain at least basic education and is literate. Here are some examples to make the idea clear. In Brazil, people experience conflict against the government because there are private corporations and politicians who manage about 88% of media and communication companies that only supports their own interests and not the public's. This results to the limitation of public sphere, because only powerful people can join the arena. Worldwide, the social networking sites are examples of arena where people could voice out their opinions and at the same time, listen to what other people say regarding a certain matter. However, the right to freedom of opinion and expression was neglected when internet and social media invades our way of communication. Know your right as a human and as a citizen.
Great. That is a terrific video created by WAC to really help us again have a common definition of what we mean when we say public space or public sphere. So now we'll begin our dialogue together. I have the pleasure to introduce the Honorable Emma Theophilus. She'll share the challenges and opportunities of public space in Namibia and also regionally. The Honorable Emma Theophilus is Deputy Minister of Information, Communication, and Technology for the Government of Namibia. Before that government appointment, she was a youth activist around issues of gender, children's rights, sustainable development, and youth employment. She served as Deputy Speaker of the Youth Parliament of the Republic of Namibia and also as the Junior Mayor of the City of Windhoek, among many other roles. In her role as Deputy Minister and Member of Parliament, she plans to better communicate the activities and programs of the government of the Republic of Namibia and assist in preparing the Namibian nation for the fourth industrial revolution. Welcome, Honorable Theophilus. It's fantastic to see you online.
Thank you so much, Cassie, and thank you so much for having me. A very good morning to all of you and to those that are joining us from all over the world. Thank you so much for your invitation to talk about digital justice, especially in a time such as this, where COVID-19 has impacted all our lives in one way or another and made those inequalities that existed before more prominent and more wider. Cassie, I'd like to start my talk with just highlighting the situation in Namibia, for example, and on the African continent, which is quite similar, where there might be variations here and there, and of course the world where all of us have our own experiences in our countries. So Namibia is one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have such a disparity between the rich and the poor. And this is, of course, not a doing coming from anything else than our past. We had a very difficult past, colonialism, apartheid, and we gained our independence 31 years ago, where the poverty percentage was dangling around the 90s. We have made progress in this past 30 years, but there is still much more work to do. But compounded with that, when you look at social justice and access to social justice, all those fault lines from our past continue to haunt us. We still have a higher than the needed violent society in terms of gender-based violence and femicide. And those are scars and wounds that did not necessarily heal from the past we have experienced. But as we come in economically, the issue of the digital divide continues to increase those inequalities and exacerbate their impacts, because now once a person didn't have access, for example, to information physically, when they're cut out from digital spaces and cut out from conversations and opportunities online, they are missing out on those double opportunities in the real life and in online spaces. So it's really a sort of double-edged sword when it comes to us. And the similarities on the African continent are not any different. We still have a higher number of Africans on the continent, up above 64%, who might not have access to broadband and therefore do not have access to digital spaces in order to exercise their human rights. And the truth of the matter is the revolution of the ICTs has changed the society fundamentally and will probably continue to do so in the foreseeable future. And that is why I'm very grateful for the opportunity I've been given at this age by His Excellency the President of the Hage Geingob, appointing a 23-year-old as a not only as a member of Parliament, but as a Deputy Minister of ICTs, to be able to bring to light the issues affecting over 60% of young people in my country, who make up 60% of the population, and how if we don't have a digital strategy in place, for example, if we don't have a plan for a broadband policy that is able to narrow the gap of the digital divide in our country, more and more of these young people will be sort of excluded from decision making, from opportunities where employment is concerned, for opportunities to access their human rights and their economic rights for them to be able to be productive citizens of the country. So that is an opportunity and a role I take very seriously. So as it stands, Namibia just hosted the World Press Freedom Day in April this year. And I am proud to say that Namibia is number one on the continent when it comes to press freedom. And we take this very seriously as a country because having the opportunity for press to have the freedom to report to around the issues in the country, it gives the opportunity for the press to be a fourth estate. Different from the executive, legislature, and the judiciary, but making media the fourth estate to try to propel development in a country. And that's something as a government we take very seriously, and we appreciate that we can have legislation and protections to the media so that we are able to coexist side by side. Because at the end of the day, we all have our society's interests at heart. And on the backdrop of the World Press Freedom Day, we reflected on our access to information bill. As you know, Africa as a continent as a whole only has one country that has an access to information law, and that is Ghana. And Namibia, in the past few years, has been drafting an access to information bill. We have come to the conclusion of our draft of our access to information bill, and we are looking at tabling it this week in Parliament. So it's such a good coincidence that I'm giving this talk in the week that we're set to table our access to information bill. And our access to information bill really is benchmarking best practices and best practices of laws across the world. We're looking at having an information commissioner and a deputy information commissioner, and putting guidelines in place where public institutions are able to communicate information to the public. I reflect on my own experiences as a young person. Before becoming a member of parliament, becoming a deputy minister, I was very active in spaces that were looking at empowering the rights of women and children, and I still am. But I needed to have the right information to be able to either influence or lobby politicians at the time, or to get grants from international organizations to run projects that actually support women and children. So information is an important tool, and it allowed me to access my political rights at the time, having that information. And I can attest that it's not so easy to get the right information, because not all public servants have been trained to be able to give information in its right forms or timely and efficiently. And systems still need to be developed to allow institutions, especially public institutions, to be able to give that information to the public for public use and consumption in order for them to access their human rights. So I'm happy to share more experiences from Namibia and what that looks like in the context around digital justice, and how that really propels social justice. I've read a report by the World Bank Group that says that, low and middle income countries have every 10% percentage point in increase in broadband penetration ensure that economic growth grows by 1.8%. And I think that is true, especially in countries who are low and middle income usually have a very young population. Namibia, being a middle income country by the definition of the World Bank, has a 60% youth population. And that's a big bulge. And young people are acceptable to ICTs. They use it more frequently than the older generation. And we need to cater for their needs in order to be able to ensure that they're able to access their human rights, they access economic opportunities, especially where youth unemployment is concerned. And that is something that we're looking forward to in terms of passing this access to information bill and other supporting legislature to ensure that the digital divide does not grow wider, but we actually narrow it in the few years to come. Thank you so much, Cassie.
Thank you, Honorable Theophilus. First of all, I want to say, being with the World YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, we are a worldwide network of leaders and young women leaders whom we follow. So it's so incredible and makes sense to see your inspired vision for what the future for Namibia should and could look like. And your clarity of conviction and data to make that happen. So a real pleasure to hear you speak today. When you talk about those fault lines from the past, continuing to haunt us, the colonialism, apartheid, that really, and then as you built out about opportunities and challenges, you really have given us, everyone in the symposium, a really clear picture of what's going on in Namibia and also regionally. I do wish you really good luck as you table the access to information, peace, law, and parliament. And again, very, very much I congratulate you for being such a leader for 6 out of 10 young Namibians that are watching closely and I'm sure ready to follow your lead. So thank you. Now we'll hear from Mr. Goran Buldiaski. He will share unique perspectives on public space in the European region. In the video, we heard about the concept of free flow of information. And what I would share before Mr. Buldiaski speaks and before I introduce him a little bit more closely is when I was in my early 20s, about the age of Honorable Theophilus, Emma Theophilus, a lot of the work that I did in a state in the United States was with the Open Society Institute and Foundation. And it was a real place to do what I thought was relevant and pivotal and impactful work. So it's exciting to introduce Goran Buldiaski, the director of Open Society Foundation's Berlin office and the Open Society Initiative of Europe. His areas of expertise include democratic transition, civil society, citizen participation, and effective government in Europe, notably Central and Eastern Europe, and also the Western Balkans. He has publications on democracy, think tanks, and policy relevant issues that have appeared in many publications, such as Politico Europe, Open Democracy, Mediapart, and The Independent. And he's a member of the European Council of Foreign Relations. Thank you, Mr. Buldiaski, for sharing with us today.
Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, knowing that many of you are in different time zones. So a pleasure to have you here, and actually what an apt conference and what an apt topic. Not only because I come from Open Society Foundations, which is well known for our work, but lately is also well known as, our founder is in the middle of so many conspiracy theories and so much of what we see as the peril of the internet. So I'm not going to talk about that, but you should know that in our daily work, we really have to handle a lot of that. What's important is actually a conference like this that gathers people who are experts and non-experts in the subjects, in my opinion, are vital for recreating the both digital but also the offline space. Because if so many of the forces that that I'm going to talk about are left unchecked and left in play, we will really risk to lose the values of our lives and the values of our communities. And frankly speaking, that's not a discussion that I would like to leave to our fellow engineers and computer geeks. Being an engineer myself, probably I have a bit of reputation to say that. Second, yesterday we had a lot of interesting and very mind-provoking input. I really enjoyed the tour de force that Ms. Uberschar shared and all the different challenges that she laid out for us. Ms. Green spoke a lot about the dark side of artificial intelligence, very often tainted by the military that happens behind our backs. Then Sarah Macaria spoke a lot about the biases. Actually, a lot of our work is in the artificial intelligence and how we can counter the built imbalances, especially against women and people of color. And also the Bishop Bedford Strom, who spoke a lot about what could be done. I'll try to build on all that, but first I would like to start an anecdote that happened to me recently with a friend here in Berlin who works in digital communication, actually digital marketing to be more specific. I told him with a great pride of how really zealously I click on all these manage cookies button, and I do undo, don't follow me, and all the signs. And he just kind of grinned at me and said, like, well, you probably belong to 1 to 5% of population, including even here in Germany, which is quite well known of really taking care of its privacy. And so, and he also added, you know, my job will look very different if the things were turned around. I'll come back to this notion of clicking on cookies and actually what do we give to internet and what we take back. But I would like to focus first on the way how we can reimagine our digital public sphere. I think we are beyond the point where we can afford not to reimagine it. And I would like to refer to what we as individuals, what philanthropies, what governments, and others can do about that. The threats were laid out yesterday in a very comprehensive manner. I will just run them through. We really face a big challenge that our fundamental principles of democracy and human rights are really harmed by unchecked tech power. Then, if we look at actually unchecked digital power, we're looking to annihilate also the systems of governance that we know, because the companies are certainly more powerful than so many countries in this world. We've given away the public space. I mean, imagine if physically you say, okay, here's a square, we have it, or here is, I don't know, Tiergarten, a place to walk and enjoy here in Berlin. Imagine if you just say, okay, you Google, take it over, and you know, I'm gonna give everything what I wear before I enter in the park, which is probably the parallel what we do when we enter into the cyberspace. And then last but not least, the cyberspace, instead of being the promise of a positive, uplifting space of creativity, which still is also very much subject to geopolitical threats and actually weaponized use of information wars. And my work, in our work, actually, we support so many organizations coming from Eastern Europe that actually are trying to really fight a huge disinformation that, as we all know, happens on regular basis with troll farms and whatnot, but as well, in particularly before and during elections, really threatens to harm, if not even eliminate, our democratic setup. Now, what can we do? First of all, I think it's important that the vision of a human-centric digital space based on fundamental rights and solidarity is possible. I would even make one more bolder statement. I would say that the future of human rights will be resolved in the way how we enjoy them through the digital, because how we will regulate that space, which now adds more and more hours of our lives on the digital screen, will inevitably not only trickle in, but we influence how as well in the offline space we treat these values. I see three elements in our action. One is regulation. The second one is continuous building of access to alternative. And then the third one is probably even at the very individual level, resistance to surveillance capitalism, where individuals can take action and protect themselves and their community from it. On the question of regulation, we are in Europe. European Union likes to proud itself of developing the third way of digital. And next year will be really a crunch year in that respect, because if all things go according to plan, we'll have the most comprehensive regulation in the world with the Digital Services Act and a number of other acts that actually will have to put some checks and balances on the companies and the governments. There's so many things that can be done. This is just a very short list. We talked a lot about the behavioral advertising, or you talked a lot about behavioral advertising and how actually to stop that. Imagine you go in a shopping mall and imagine you have like 2 cameras and minimum 10 sensors on all of your fingers and at least 2 or 3 sensors on your eyes. This is what's happened quite often on internet. If this was happening in the physical space, you will never, ever probably enter that shop. But on internet, we just enter and re-enter. Not even that, the data that is collected on us knows better what our choices are than we are consciously aware. And that cannot lead to a good, because that brings so much power in the hands of few. Collection of personal data, which we leave behind, dark patterns, where actually the companies are not only registering the data, but they're using us to lure us in. That's like, eating the next chocolate just 10 times over when it comes to calories. And in our case, that's like the data bytes and the way what we do with that. And then, if we think about companies, if they were operating in any other industry, even the dirtiest oil industries, they would have been probably broken up because they combine so many different things. Or if they were banking, they would say, wait a second, you cannot do both retail and investment because that will bring you in a conflict of interest. In the technical space, we have such a constellation and so much of abuse. Access to alternative. We had a very good example earlier this year where there was a change in regulations in WhatsApp, and suddenly applications called Signal and Telegram that you really had to do hard to search were at the top of the charts of downloads, because so many people were afraid, and then their data not to be shared with WhatsApp, and they suddenly moved to the alternatives. Alternatives are out there. Yesterday, the bishop spoke about public avenues. We really need to create them. And I know sometimes they will say there will be a lot of laughter about that. The market will say, oh, nobody comes to you and whatnot. But let me not remind you, I'm old enough to remember a platform called MySpace. Probably most of you will not. But MySpace was there before Facebook. And it existed. And MySpace thought that will be the space forever. This is an industry of a great disruption. Nothing against Facebook or the Googles of this world and whatnot. But in some ways, if we expect disruptions to happen, the offer should be there. And interestingly enough, the offer is there. Just go and see how many search engines are out there that will do probably equally decent job, actually maybe even better, given that Google searches only 4% of the websites online, maybe even a better job of search without keeping the data on you. So the alternative exists, they just need a boost. And in places like Europe, that boost could be also funded with public money, and I think we should not shy away with some kind of a neoliberal resistance to it. Speaking about resistance, I really want to put the power in the individual and really think about what we can do. Just for the power of your imagination, imagine that every fifth Christian around the world does not use Facebook for a day. That's 400 million. That will be the size of the third biggest state on planet Earth, just for a day, or imagine a week. I'm not saying that we should stay here, public revolutions of a sort, but just I really let you to imagine the power of what signal that will say, and it will say, wait a second, actually the values that you promote are not the values that I stand for. And there's so many different examples around this. And this is not to stage revolutions. This is actually, as many other speakers mentioned, this is also to raise the awareness. Or imagine if you use other download applications. Imagine if you do it online in a VPN and not in an application where actually you've given all the rights to the developer of the app. There's so many things that we can do. So coming back to the cookies and manage cookies button, I really, if one thing you remember from these 10.5 minutes, I would like to remember to click the manage cookies button. If you're in Europe, you definitely do that. If you're outside of Europe, actually you can get a VPN from a European IP address and then you can do it again. And if you're outside of Europe, don't forget regulation is also a key, so we have to fight. But in doing that, we should not forget, referees never win a football game. So we should make sure that in addition to refereeing and regulation, there are also players on the field. And those players are maybe the smaller, the non-profit apps which are out there, they need a boost, or people in government with really good ideas, they could develop a public product and allow us to enjoy it in the public space rather in the surveillance capitalism. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation later. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Goran, Mr. Boldiaski. I'm really struck by your optimism coming from you. It's not exactly what I expected, and your optimism that we can reimagine the digital space and manage that unchecked digital power is pretty heartening. And thanks for also the specific suggestions for how we can begin as individuals. And I was struck as well by the Honorable Theophilus you talked more about laws and systems and the value and the potential of the fourth estate. And then we had Mr. Boldiaski talking more about individual power and influence and the way that individuals can lean into pushing back on those forces that otherwise may be left unchecked. The European perspective and global perspective shared, as well as the really specific Namibian and African perspectives, really put us in place in time, I think, and from very different perspectives on this concept of the digital era and public sphere. And now we look to Ms. Frederique, or Dr. Frederique van Oorshoot, to respond to the two viewpoints that have been shared, especially from a unique and very important theological perspective. Mr. Boldiaski talked about the great disruption that happens in digital space, and I'm hoping that Frederique, you talk about and match up this great disruption for those of us in ecumenical and theological communities. When Frederique is done, we'll open the conversation up to all three speakers. And I want to remind those of you that are participating to share questions in the chat box, on the YouTube live stream, or on the digital wall. With that, Frederique, please share.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and the stimulating contributions. I would like to very shortly take up some of the points and add my own thoughts from a theological perspective. I want to do this in the form of 5 statements, very concise and of course very abbreviated, to stimulate the discussion. So at first, digital publics are mostly governed by algorithms and platform economy. We heard a lot about that yesterday, and Goran Boldiaski already strengthened this point. So I just want to add a very self-critical question from a theological angle. Do we really think about these structures if we are talking about sending out our own message as churches into the world? Do we remember that these systems are not just a problem for other users, but our problem? Our problem when we use commercial platforms for church work and thus aggregate data from ourselves and from the people we want to reach and leave it for others to sail. Goran Boldiaski already strengthened the point. The alternative exists, and I want to encourage the churches and theological actors to think about where we can develop our own platforms, what alternative platforms we can use to not be only part of the problem, but be part of the solution. A second statement on this. It's a very short one. The medium is the message. I borrowed this one. You might recognize it. It's a very old thesis from Marshall McLuhan. And it reminds us the places and the channels, the media in which we talk, not only shape our content, they are our content. Emma Theophilus strengthens the digital divide. We should be aware of this, thinking about using digital spaces in churches. We use spaces that exclude a lot of people. So what does it mean? The medium is the message when we want to talk about digital publics. In theology, we love to talk about public theology when it comes to the role of churches in society. And what does such a theology look like when it moves into digital spaces? So I want to make a third statement on this. I think public theology in digital spaces is a theology of witnesses, a testimonial theology closely relating content identity for theological reasons. Digital spaces at their best are focused on participation and interaction. This is really a strength of digital spaces and social networks. Users write and read at the same time, they share, they moderate. Additionally, we see a peculiar connection between the content and the identity. I am what I like, I want to frame that. The digital self is constituted by its visualized interconnections. So interactions are therefore highly influenced by private content, and at the same time, they are part of a public debate. So there is no strict separation between the public and the private self. Surprisingly, we know this pattern in theology pretty well. The close connection between content and identity is similar to the concept of witness and testimony we see in the New Testament. Spreading the message of the gospel, talking about the gospel means always talking about ourselves, talking about our understanding of the gospel. Therefore, all good digital public theology for me is a theology of witness, I want to suggest. Understanding public theology as a theology of witness has two major consequences. Firstly, witness is always a contested witness. It is, and I quote, for theological reasons, kenotic, self-restraining, and self-critical, as the Brazilian theologian Rudolf von Sinner puts it. A second consequence is raised by the fourth statement. Public theology in digital spaces can be a collaborative theology, a citizen theology, I want to call it. The participatory and net-like structure of most digital communication spaces makes it inevitable to practice a participatory and interactive public theology. I said earlier that the public and the private are not opposed to each other, they interfere with each other. And there are a lot of people talking together. The debates are not one way, they are more interactive. And this is what I think what theological debates in the digital spaces should be about. Together with some friends, I started to call this kind of theology citizen theology, a new term based on the concept of citizen science. We built up a platform for that based on an open science platform, and it became a space for collaborative thinking, writing, and arguing about theological issues used mostly by young people. Theological issues we understand very broadly as thinking about religious issues, and I think we need more of these spaces, holding up public spaces for a theology from the people, from different angles in life. So building up something which is really a participatory and exploratory form, a citizen theology, I want to call it. And let me briefly take up a last thing Goran Buldovsky pointed out. He spoke of the need to reimagine digital spaces. And I want to underline this and even put it a little further, maybe a little more theologically. I see a major task for public theology in identifying and criticizing social imaginations of the digital disruption itself. So this is my fifth statement, reimagination. Reimagining not only digital spaces, but the digital transformation itself unveils the eschatological horizon for digital imaginaries. Let me clarify this a little. As digital technologies are not perceivable sensually, they depend even more than other technological changes on implicit imaginations, on the metaphors, the narratives, the story we tell about what the digital is and how it should work. Following a long tradition of imaginations and stories in the Christian tradition, theology and the church have a sensorium for such narratives and stories. To reflect these means to unveil the eschatological horizon of disruption and digital changes. So one can ask, where do data generating companies promise a godlike providence caring for us in all of our ways? Where do promises of salvation in the debate about artificial intelligence appear. And I see a lot of these figures coming up in the debates, the ethical debates on the digital technologies. And this adds another layer to our own ethical thinking on AI. And we heard a lot about that yesterday. So seeing and criticizing these imaginations, offering valid other imaginations based in humanizing user-friendly platforms might be an important task for church and theology in digital spaces. Thank you for your support.
Thank you, Frederic. You are the third speaker to share with us some real optimism around public theology as a theology of witness. So thank you for that response, having us look at all these issues from another angle. So all three speakers have given us very much to consider, and now we have time to focus in and hear directly from them in relation to questions that have come from participants of the symposium. We will end the session at 10:35 Central Eastern Time at the latest, and so we have a good amount of time to very much dig in. We're going to begin with a question for Mr. Graham Boldiaski, and that is, what kinds of civil society could reclaim the public sphere? Where should they direct their energies?
Those because the field, for example, here in Germany is very rich. Some few other countries in Europe probably equally so, but in principle there is a dearth of technically savvy and people who will understand. Because there's really a lot of sort of black boxes where we don't know what's happening inside, and there is a need to have a technological understanding. That's one group of organizations, and actually in the work of our philanthropy, and not only us, there are other philanthropists as well, we try to support and build a more vibrant field of those organizations. But those organizations cannot do things on their own. Even if, even if we get the regulation that I spoke about, that regulation needs life. And that regulation needs to be not only imposed, but actually it needs to become like a way of life. And for that, you need really coalitions of broad organizations. That's why it was not just to be kind at the beginning. It was also, that's why I said it's really important to talk in settings like this one. If you think about the digital and the World Council of Churches, of course, it will be only one of the topics that will be on your agenda, but you will not say that, oh, we are specializing on that topic. But it will be really important that it's not only on the agenda, but you say, okay, who will be our strategic partners, with whom we have to? What's actually in our interest to have some of those regulations being changed? What actually our really rich and wide membership can do to help those changes gain root? So I'm talking about actually really broad coalitions, and those could be coalitions not only among civil society. For example, let's not forget, I spoke about the engineers and whatnot. Not only that they're humans, most of them have a lot of faith, and be that religious or they set themselves based on certain values that will definitely clash perhaps with the values that today's internet companies practice with their help. Actually, there are a lot of models in the world where some of those engineers help the civil society to understand what's happening. Some of them are open or closed whistleblowers showing those technologies. So one has to go in those coalitions. And let's not forget the power of the government. I mentioned earlier that a lot of governments, because especially when they come from smaller states, they do not have the power. But they still have the governance power in their places. And a lot of innovation a lot of perhaps courageous steps in smaller domains in, let's say, getting the services right, using the software that will not track you all the time. And I think all of us, individuals, philanthropy, civil society organizations, governments can do much better. And again, that will not mean not to use the softwares that are dominating the markets today. That will actually make sure that they operate within a sense of making money, but also with a sense of maintaining some public good in a sphere which is not constantly surveilled, and in a sphere that actually helps not only the profits, but as well our own well-being.
Thank you, Mr. Polyaski. And the following question is for the Honorable Theophilus, and it's as follows. The Windhoek Declaration set a benchmark for press freedom in Namibia and Africa. Can we look forward to a new Windhoek Declaration on digital freedoms?
Thank you so much, Cassie, and thank you for the question. Well, after the World Press Freedom Day, we did adopt a Windhoek Plus 30 declaration, and it did cater to some of the issues we're talking today, but not exclusively to digital spaces. However, we are in the process of, as a country, not necessarily as an offering to the world, looking at cybersecurity laws and legislation to protect our citizens from issues of privacy and use of personal data. So definitely, yes, as we hand over the World Press Freedom Day celebrations to the next country later this year, I think it can form part of a discussion to see how that country can take forward issues related to digital spaces. Thank you.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, you spoke of the 6 of 10 citizens of Namibia being youth. What's your vision? What's your strategy to engage those youth in the work that you're talking about here and the vision that you're sharing?
Yes, so for example, we have some parallel things running. The first one is we are looking at putting together a youth think tank, because the fourth industrial revolution truly should be youth-led, considering also that majority of our population is young people. So young people shaping what the future of the fourth industrial revolution in our country should look like. So that's one. Second, we have recently just called out for vacancies for young people to form part of an electronic information systems committee that will be able to be the advisory body to the minister, not to me, but to the minister of the ministry in relation to future legislation to be drafted to cater for electronic systems in the country. And lastly, we're embarking on working with the Interparliamentary Union and our national parliament in having a digital youth conference, looking at how young people can continuously practice their political rights in the space of digitalization and systems, so that young people do not fall out of discussions of decision making as decisions happen sort of like the real world space and not necessarily on digital spaces, and young people being on the digital space. So just trying to sort of create that link between decision making and finding the population that should influence decisions on digital spaces.
Thanks. I really appreciate the challenge and opportunity before you. It's, I think, easier said than done sometimes. The next question is for Frederic. One of the participants has said, thank you. I agree that public theology is a theology of witness and testimony. With the emphasis on citizen theology, the participant is curious to explore the tension between a desire to offer alternative platforms So perhaps a mustard seed alternative approach. So planting ourselves on existing platforms, but perhaps it's not so much about new platforms, but maybe the platforms we already have. For witness and testimony, what's the path forward are both equally valuable. What are your thoughts?
Oh, thank you so much. And I just read a similar question from Arnie Danielson in the chat. Well, I would say at best we need both. And I like the picture Goran Buljowski offered, so that we need the regulations, but we always need flesh to these bones. So it's kind of a double strategy, I would suggest. And I think we need these kind of smaller platforms to find the niche we want to fit in. So what we are doing is kind of a theological endeavor coming from scientific theology, church theology, bringing that together. And what we do is that we use established platforms always to refer to our own platform. So trying to combine the different issues, because I think we need to know our limits. We can try to influence the regulations we have on a state or international level as churches, and we do this, and I really appreciate that. And at the same time, I think to build up what our own platforms, or building up own platforms, really enables us to have a structure, the medial structure for what we really want to do. So I think we have tried, or what I think might be the best approach at the moment, trying to combine both endeavors.
So both, take both paths forward. Excellent, thanks. So just a follow-up question to that. What are your reflections as you observe how populist movements use the current digital platforms to their benefit, to their purpose, and any lessons learned? And maybe after you answer that follow-up question, I'd like to hear a similar response from both of the other speakers. Again, how populist movements use current digital platforms, and what lessons have we learned that should inform our future?
Well, this is a pretty large one, I would say. What we learned from an ethical perspective is kind of the worst side of social network discussion. So how the focus on emotions, the biases, really are succeeding on the structure and the algorithms the platforms are built up. So this is a very, very complex problem for theological thinking as well, I think, because we need to try not to fall in the same trap, but in the other way, we want to try to reach out. So we want to gain attention, and the ways to gain attention on the platforms are these kind of ways. So I think it highlights one of the very basic problems on the structure of most commercial platforms regarding emotional discourses and biases, filter bubble effects, and all these kind of things. And I would be really interested in what Goran Buljowski says to this, because he's an expert in that. I'm just doing the ethical reflection.
Which is an important one. So thank you for that. Yeah, maybe Goran, if you would speak next to this question. And it is a huge topic around what have we learned from populist movements? What are the do's and don'ts moving forward? Maybe highlight one don't.
No surprise, I'm burning out of desire to answer this question. And then, I had like an example about Google that provides ad services to 86% of the sites that carry coronavirus conspiracies. Or YouTube, according to the Center for Countering Digital Hate, found that basically 12 anti-vaccine influencers, or as they call them, the disinformation dozen, was responsible for 65% of active vaccine content on Facebook and Twitter in the US. Or YouTube recommended Alex Jones' conspiracy theory videos more than 15 billion times. So if you look at that, this is, you were surprised how I was optimist. I was optimist because actually we know this. And not only we know that it's wrong in a normative sense, I have to say the heart of this is that it's a business of attention. So it doesn't matter what it is, if somebody screams on the internet and then gets attention, and that converts into clicks, and that converts in a lot of dollars, mind you, most of them untaxed, that's a good business. Is it good society? Is it a good public sphere? Certainly not. And I think, knowing it is the first step of how you can start countering. So first and foremost, yesterday there was a reference to Shoshana Zuboff's seminal book on surveillance capitalism. We have to see actually not how these companies will stop to exist or stop making money, but what are the other businesses that actually, or other business models that they can use in order not to really multiply essentially lies. And I think that's the problem. That's really, really huge problem, because all of these companies claim that they're not editors. If this was as you know very well, if this was a newspaper, the editor would have been held accountable because they have to police content. I'm not saying that we have to treat them as newspapers, but treating them as just kind of benign service providers. They say, "Oh, sorry, that was popular, and that's why somebody there in the room was clicking, multiply, because that's absolutely not the way how to go forward." So I think, and there is an exploration. There are also companies that make money, which is not on these business models. The other thing, what we really have to make sure is how much of this approach is actually transformed to the public services. There was a big issue, for example, in policing. Yesterday, there was a reference to the conversation about prisons and people of color in the United States and how they will be discriminated and whatnot. The same goes, for example, in the police services. If you have a database that is largely based on white people or white faces, inevitably that database will have a bias towards anybody who is different. Or if that database contains an oversized information that is actually coded in the way that singles out the people who are different, then no wonder that police officers on the ground will do a search as many more times. And in some countries like France, the UK, 10 times more, you're likely to be stopped on the street by police if you happen not to be white. And that changes life. That's no longer digital. And now imagine this goes with LinkedIn, with algorithmic search for jobs. If you're called Muhammad, there could be out there an algorithm that immediately actually raises every CV and every application that has a host of names that are associated with Muhammad. It's humans. It's humans who control, and then you put the artificial intelligence in the work, but basically it develops on. So I think what's important is that not only to understand, but we start not only putting limits with the regulation. I'm a believer in regulation, but the regulation alone will not help us. It's important that we get actually ourselves to say, hey, wait a second. Let me stop about that. I'm actually feeding the beast with this, and this is something I can even speak from our own experience. At the top of this conversation, I mentioned how much we were subject to hatred just because our founder comes from a Jewish background, and how many conspiracy theories are there. And actually, we learned a great deal. Some of those things are many other people face on everyday basis. Many people actually left the public digital sphere because they were harassed online. And I think these are the issues where we really have to start paying attention. And even small victories there would show that there is not only there is a change, but actually these things could be altered. The business model, our own behavior, and then regulation also of both the businesses and the individuals, and what they feel not only free to do, but what kind of harm they can do in the digital space that probably they would never think of doing anything similar in the offline space. I think this probably will be the three top lines that I will take about countering populist movements. And believe me, they will be not only successful, but there are examples where the populist movements have not gathered the attention across Europe that they desired, because simply their message was not amplified. And like every troll, if you don't feed it, then it doesn't grow.
Thank you so much. And now, Honorable Theophilus, again, along the same vein of populist movements and digital space, you're pushing, the access to information law. You're driving for a vision where there's greater access to this digital sphere, to this public. So what would you say about kind of the opportunity, but also the dangers of populist movements and what can happen in the public sphere?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, the two speakers before me said so coherently about the need for accountability and responsibility. I think it all comes down to accountability, whether it's regulation from state actors or it's communities or consumers holding particular companies or giants accountable. And especially in terms of our experience with this pandemic, and I speak from this experience because my ministry was tasked with communicating around the realities of COVID-19 and all of that, and we had a very difficult time pushing back the conspiracy theories, the medicines that were recommended that led to some people losing their lives and all of that, and it was such a difficult time, and it is very difficult to counter those populist movements and views, especially in a space where at a click of a button it could reach millions of people. So it's all about accountability, whether it's through regulation, but more importantly, information. People need to know information that is authentic, that is verified, and for them to make their own judgment and not somebody else's judgment. And it's also quite true. These companies, at a point in time, their algorithms are influenced by human beings. Yes, artificial intelligence might be automated in some instances, but its true identity is with the humans that put it together. And as someone who is in government, moving that accountability over, that onus over to the other side becomes a better opportunity for us to control the narratives that might be set out into society and some that might be very harmful towards our citizens. So I can only agree with the sentiments shared. Thank you.
So we've, through the presentations and discussions, we've certainly, and then most recently talking about algorithms, what's happening in the chat and some of what's been shared, identify that there's a real need for accountability and also joined forces, leaning sectors, leaders, leaning into each other in order to pursue things such as accountability and also really leveraging this public sphere toward good, toward human rights. I think Ben said there's no doubt that this public sphere will become the place, the nexus of human rights. Maybe perhaps we're certainly headed that way. So with that in mind, if each of you would answer the question of how you imagine a coalition between academic research, theology, civil society organizations, churches, and political entities. So we're asking you to keep moving along that optimistic, visionary line of thinking. How would you imagine that coalition existing or working? What does that look like for all of us? And perhaps maybe begin with Frederique.
Well, thank you so much. Coming from the academic research part, I would say that it works out pretty well. I'm working at an interdisciplinary research institute, which is founded by the Protestant churches, thinking about these questions of digitality and all these kind of things. So I might be in the very privileged situation to have a kind of a structure and an organizational structure to think about these terms. what I see is that the questions of algorithm accountability, robot ethics, AI ethics, all these kind of things are entered by theological voices just not very often. So it's kind of high complex topic. And I don't know many colleagues thinking about that. So I think what we kind of need is, well, to bringing this more into focus and then thinking about that in the theological and ethical training. So I think there's a lot of fear or understanding what is going on, going into the very deep technical details on that. So I think we need experts from that field working in academic theology and working with the churches to enable us to think about that ethically in an apt manner, not making some ethical statements from above, which don't touch any of the technical grounds. Which are talked about, especially in the field of algorithm and accountability, which is a pretty hard to understand thing, even for trained scientists from other fields. So I think we need these expertise more, and I would love to encourage the churches and the institutions to bring the fields together. I see that it works pretty well in some of the English-speaking regions, but in the German scientific area, I see there's a huge gap between the ethical thinking about these questions and the technological understanding, especially in the theological point of view.
Okay, so you've been witness to some coalition and cross-pollinate work, but largely looks like a huge opportunity that's to date untapped. Yeah. Okay. Honorable Theophilus, would you share next how you imagine a coalition between academic research, theology, civil society organizations, churches, and politics or political leaders, entities?
No, I think so too. I agree with Frederique that I think it's a good opportunity to put together resources to influence the space, but also more importantly to bring the aspect of whether it's representation into the space, because all of us, one way or another, are using the spaces, these digital spaces, but not necessarily have the representation of those that consider us as leaders, whether politically and otherwise, but also using the resources of research to actually empower those spaces to reflect all our realities. So I think it would be a good way to have those synergies come together in that coalition to assist the digital spaces to reflect what we have been talking about here today and others that have been talking about representation in the space, so that we are not left behind when it comes to considerations around ethics, morality, representation, all of that. And I think then that would become valuable in shaping the future, because I think we're at a very good nexus at this point where obviously COVID-19 as a pandemic has accelerated the need to look into these issues. We have an opportunity now at the cusp of all of this to then see how we can collaborate to ensure that we're not left behind and that the influence is not out of our reach, whether it's state actors, the church, academic researchers, whoever. This is an opportunity, I think, that could be valuable in how we shape digital spaces in the future.
Thank you so much. So before we go to you, Reverend, I want to add a slight twist to this question about this idea of imagining a coalition that works together. Because when you started, at the beginning of what you shared, one of the observations you made, and these are not your words, but what I heard was that this digital space, what's happening is so quick. It's happening like this. So what we know today is not what we know tomorrow. The context that we discuss today or this week is not the context for next week. You know, for example, I read recently, and that made sense. I recently read an autobiography of an individual who shared a lot of state information for a nation. And he said basically the way I got away with it, the way I was able to gather this data and do it is because I was the one who knew what was happening and no one else was keeping up. So I knew all the loopholes and I took full advantage of it. So again, adding to this idea that it's so fast. So when I hear this idea of a coalition between academic research, theology, civil society organizations, churches, politics, when I think about what I pose to you is, what does that coalition look like? So the original question, imagine what that could look like. But I'm also curious to hear from you, how is that possible at the speed? So with that premise that everything's moving fast and only so much is known, what does an effective coalition look like?
First, sort of let me a bit not necessarily debate, but reflect on the fastness. You know, the digital space is still super fast and it's prone to changes. But let's not forget that the big 5 companies have slowed it down. And part of it is because actually they could co-opt or buy or destroy the potential competition. So that's one of the ways why regulation is needed in order to allow as well to have that space. So in some ways we need to encourage that power of disruption for, in a way, the benefit of the humankind, and sometimes probably at the expense of number of shareholders that put the money in that company or number of employees in that company. And I think that was the thing. And at the moment, actually, there are many fields where this is super fast, but also there are fields where it's super slowed down. You know, look at the social platforms. You know, to create a new Facebook would be a little miracle today because of the power that the Facebook has. But this is not to despair. First, what I have to say is that we have to sort of practice what we say or practice what we preach, if you like. And that is like, what platforms, what do we do in our lives? Also as individuals, but also as employees or also as members of that community. Actually switching to even sometimes the same platforms allow, just it's in some dark corner that you have to disable so many things and you have to be knowledgeable. But once when you do that, actually, you will be able to do an access to the same space in a way that you will not leave so much of a digital traction, and you will be able to get the same information. So first I will say, what do we use in both workplace and private life? Second, I think we have to open our eyes of what's happening with the societal fabric. You're a faith-based community of all different kinds of people. We talked a bit about the consequences and the perils, actually, of misogyny and the racial discrimination, among many other discriminations. But let's not forget that these platforms also break our societal fabric along classes. Think no further. Uber drivers, delivery drivers. Actually, if you think about that, there's a big fight. I mean, finally, Spain has a law where delivery guys have to be full employees. And, you know, of course, the companies will fight that law. But look what does it. They will enjoy the same employment opportunities and the same employment protection as everybody else. But what's interesting that, let's say, the middle class, upper middle class, will sometimes notice it because the bill will be passed on them. Otherwise, it will not notice, because actually part of that profit is also shared with those who have, and not only the richest, but also the middle class, because then the delivery will be cheaper, or as many services like to say, free of charge, built in the price. Or Uber is cheaper than the taxi driver, but at the expense of other human beings, which interestingly enough, they probably will be fellow citizens and belong to the same communities. So actually, if you think about the coalitions, I think the potential is there. Some coalitions already exist. I would enlarge the coalitions beyond just the academy or the churches or the civil society. Companies have to be there, individuals working in these companies, politicians, governments. One thing which I believe the faith-based community is punching under its weight, and that is, you know, how much of those values that you stand for are not emphasized when it comes to the digital space. And I do believe that there is an untapped opportunity, because also that's a community which is so diverse, but it also speaks to its own members from a position of legitimacy. And I do believe that more can be done. And frankly, I have to say also self-critically, on behalf of the civil society sector that we work with and so on, so often we neglect the potential of making coalitions also with the faith-based organizations. And to me, this will be coalitions that maybe will not agree on everything, but if we agree that the digital public space is an importance, so let's better do it, let's better build it. And then if for another question we will disagree, let's be it. Then we will have the space where to debate why we disagree. Now we don't have it because it has been occupied by private interests.
Excellent, good point all around. Thanks so much. So unfortunately, we have run out of time for this really stimulating conversation. And, you know, on these online platforms, the chat room on the platform, sometimes they're quiet and sometimes they're less quiet. And today it's less quiet. And I'm hoping that the chat can stay up after we all say goodbye, so that any individual that hasn't had a chance to take a look at the chat can do so. I want to thank the Honorable Theophilus, Mr. Boldiaski, and Dr. Frederic for your contributions. And before we say goodbye, I just want to read one item out of the chat pod, because it's really in line with this theme we've had, which has been toward optimism and a brighter future of accountability and witness and testimony. Julian Clark Morris wrote in the chat pod, "Perhaps we have an ideal opportunity for machine unlearning. If the problem with racist or gendered assumptions shaping commercial algorithms comes from people behind them, could we not dream of a world where AI can be taught how to overcome racism and misogyny, and even lead humans into a way of analyzing data that doesn't use those very human filters, those biases, those prejudices that we carry and that we inherit?" And that's a real fantastic, I think, way to leave this. It's fairly loaded, really important topic about the public space moving into the future in this digital era. So thanks again. I want to ask everyone attending the symposium to rejoin us at 2 p.m. Central European Time. The session will be an in-depth look at the global assessment and experience of public space with a number of case studies from around the world. So thanks again to our speakers, and to those of you that we'll see in a couple of hours. Have some tea, stretch your legs, and please keep pondering what we've discussed this morning, and the opportunity to continue that discussion will pick back up this afternoon.